The evening started quietly, the kind of shift that usually passed without any surprises. Two officers were on patrol, moving slowly through a neighborhood that had seen a few suspicious reports earlier in the week. They were both alert but calm, expecting nothing more than another routine round. The streets were dim, the traffic was light, and the cool air made everything feel slower than usual as they drove down a narrow road lined with tall trees. Their attention shifted to a black SUV parked near the curb. It looked expensive, almost too expensive for the area. The windows were dark, the kind that didn't let you see who was inside. One of the officers felt something wasn't right. The car didn't seem to belong there, and with recent reports in mind, their instincts kicked in. They slowed down, exchanging quick glances as they tried to figure out what they were dealing with. The SUV suddenly moved forward without warning. The officers reacted instantly. Thinking it could be someone trying to flee, they tried to block the vehicle. In the rush of the moment, everything unfolded too fast. The patrol car turned sharply, and the SUV swerved at the same time. A loud crash followed. Metal scraped against metal. The patrol car jolted as it collided with the backside of the SUV. The sound echoed down the empty street. For a second, everything was still. The officers felt their stomachs drop. They knew they had made contact, but they didn't know the full extent of the damage yet. They stepped out quickly, hearts pounding, hoping it wasn't as bad as it sounded, but it was worse. The SUV had a deep dent along the side, scratches running across the paint, and one of the rear lights was broken. It was clear right away that this wasn't a small bump. It was a major hit, the kind that meant paperwork, explanations, hours of stress. A few people from nearby houses stepped outside after hearing the crash. Some watched quietly, others whispered among themselves. They noticed the officers inspecting the damage, looking uneasy as they tried to piece together what had just happened. One of the officers approached the SUV carefully. The interior was empty. No driver, no passengers. That only added more confusion. Why had it moved? Why had someone parked such an expensive car here? And where had the driver gone so quickly? They radioed it in, explaining that they had accidentally damaged a vehicle that seemed out of place. Their voices were calm, but anyone listening could hear the tension beneath the surface. Accidents like this could get messy, and they knew it. While waiting for support to arrive, the officers checked the surrounding area, hoping to spot the owner. They knew someone would be upset when they saw what had happened. They braced themselves for complaints, frustration, maybe even anger. After all, damaging someone's expensive vehicle wasn't something that could be brushed off easily. A few minutes later, a pair of quiet, serious-looking people arrived. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their presence alone suggested they weren't ordinary citizens. They inspected the SUV quickly, almost too quickly, as if they were trained to assess damage in seconds. Their expressions gave away nothing. One of them made a quick phone call, speaking in a low voice. The officers stood by, unsure of what to say or do. They kept thinking about the moment of impact, replaying it again and again, wishing they had taken a different approach. More people arrived shortly after. People who clearly weren't from the local area. They seemed organized, moving with purpose. One of them asked the officers to explain what had happened. They listened carefully, nodding, but not saying much. Their calm reactions only made the officers more nervous. The officers didn't know it yet. But the SUV was not just expensive. It was protected property, belonging to someone far more important than they could have imagined. But in that moment, they were simply worried about the mistake they had made, unaware of how big the situation was about to become. After the initial assessments, the area was secured. The officers stepped aside while the new arrivals examined the SUV in detail. More onlookers gathered from nearby houses, wondering why so many officials had suddenly shown up over a simple crash. The officers kept glancing at each other, trying to stay calm. They spoke quietly, telling themselves that accidents happen and hoping this one wouldn't cost them too much. They had no idea that the night, which had started slow and simple, had just turned into one of the most stressful ones of their careers. As the scene settled, one thing became clear. This wasn't going to be handled like a regular accident. The SUV wasn't just any vehicle, and the people now controlling the scene weren't just checking for dents and scratches. Something larger was unfolding, and the officers stood right in the center of it without knowing the true weight of what they had done. The night grew quieter again, but the tension only grew stronger. The officers waited for instructions, hoping for the best, but bracing for the worst. Unaware that their routine shift had taken a turn that would follow them far beyond this single evening, the morning after the accident, the two officers woke up with heavy thoughts on their minds. What had happened the night before kept replaying in their heads, and the more they thought about it, the more they realized how serious the situation could be. They knew the SUV was expensive, but they had no idea of its real significance. Neither of them slept well, their minds racing with questions about the consequences they might face. By the time they reached the precinct, word had already started to spread. A few colleagues approached them, asking what happened. The officers tried to explain calmly, but they quickly realized that even their coworkers were whispering, hinting that this incident was far bigger than just a damaged vehicle. The tension in the air was noticeable, and it made them even more anxious. Within the hour, a formal meeting was called. Their supervisor was serious, not angry, but the gravity of the situation was clear. He explained that the SUV belonged to the director of a major federal agency, someone whose name carried weight and whose property was heavily protected. The officers could hardly believe it. They had made a mistake, but they had no idea it involved such a high-profile figure. The investigation began immediately. Security footage from the surrounding area was reviewed and body camera recordings were analyzed. Every movement, every reaction, every decision made during the accident was scrutinized. The officers were questioned repeatedly, trying to explain their thought process and actions in detail. They were honest, but honesty didn't reduce the worry they felt about the outcome. Outside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters had started to catch wind of the story, though the details were vague. People were curious, and rumors began to circulate. Who owned the SUV? Why were so many officials involved? The officers could feel the eyes of the public, even though most didn't know their names. Their mistake had become something much larger, something that could follow them beyond their careers. The officers also learned that federal agents had visited the scene. These were highly trained individuals who handled sensitive matters every day. Their presence was intimidating. They asked questions, took notes, and inspected the vehicle in detail. The officers had never seen anything like it, and it added to the pressure building inside them as the hours passed. The officers were required to give full statements. They described the sequence of events, how they had approached the SUV, and how the collision occurred. They explained their immediate reaction and how they had tried to manage the scene. The agents listened carefully but didn't give any reassurance. The officers felt the weight of every word they spoke. Throughout the day, both officers tried to process the situation. They kept thinking about what could happen next. Suspension, fines, demotions, or even criminal charges. The possibilities were overwhelming. They realized that this incident was more than a simple mistake. It was a test of their careers, their judgment, their ability to handle stress in critical situations. Meanwhile, the SUV remained secured under federal supervision. The damage was documented carefully. Photographs were taken from every angle, and the vehicle was examined for hidden issues. The officers were told to stay away from it to avoid making the situation worse. Each detail they learned about the SUV's protective features made them more aware of how serious the accident had been. It wasn't just a car. It was a part of an elaborate security system. By mid-afternoon, the officers were called back for another round of questioning. This time, the questions were sharper. Investigators wanted to know why they hadn't called for backup, why they had taken the approach they did, and whether they had followed all protocol. The officers answered as best they could, but every answer seemed to add more tension. They felt like they were walking on a thin line, one misstep away from disaster. As the day went on, the officers noticed something they hadn't expected. Despite the stress and fear, there was a small sense of relief in the way the federal agents handled the situation. The agents were professional, calm, and methodical. They didn't yell, they didn't threaten, and they treated the officers with a strange mix of caution and respect. It made the officers realize that while the situation was serious, it was not yet catastrophic. There was a chance for them to learn, explain, and make things right. Late in the day, a brief meeting was arranged with higher-ups from both the local police and the federal agency. They explained the next steps. The officers would remain on administrative leave, additional training would be required, and a full report would be submitted to review the incident. They were told that cooperation, honesty, and patience were essential. The officers nodded, understanding that the process was long, and the consequences would not disappear quickly. By evening, the officers were allowed to leave, but they didn't feel relief. They knew this was only the beginning. The accident had opened a door to a world they had not been part of before, a world where mistakes could carry far-reaching consequences. They drove home slowly, thinking about the night, the morning, and the hours that had followed. They replayed each moment, analyzing their decisions and wondering how things could have been different. That night, sleep came even harder. They lay awake, thinking about responsibility, protocol, and the importance of careful judgment. They understood that a single moment of misjudgment could ripple through their careers and beyond. They realized how important it was to remain calm, alert, and aware of the bigger picture, especially when dealing with situations that could involve high-profile individuals. The officers also reflected on their training and experience. They wondered if they had relied too much on instincts, acted too quickly, or overlooked important details. The realization was sobering. Being a law enforcement officer wasn't just about enforcing rules, it was about judgment, awareness, and understanding the consequences of every action. Their accident was a harsh reminder of that lesson. By the end of the night, the officers had reached a point of quiet determination. They didn't know what the final outcome would be. They knew one thing. They had to face it with honesty, professionalism, and patience. They understood that this mistake, though serious, could be a turning point. It could teach them lessons they would carry for the rest of their careers, and perhaps even help them guide others in the future as they drifted off to sleep. Both officers knew that tomorrow would bring more questions, more investigations, and more challenges. But they were also aware that they were not alone. They had colleagues, supervisors, and even the federal agents who had shown professionalism and fairness. The night had changed them, made them more aware, and prepared them for the difficult days ahead. The accident was no longer just a simple collision. It had become a moment that would shape their understanding of responsibility, accountability, and the delicate balance of power in their profession. The investigation intensified the next morning. The two officers were called back to the precinct earlier than usual, a sense of urgency in the air. They walked through the familiar halls, but everything felt different. The usual chatter was gone, replaced by quiet conversations and occasional glances toward them. It was clear that everyone knew about the incident. The atmosphere was tense. Inside the briefing room, several investigators were waiting. They were serious and precise, with a focus that made the officers feel like every word and movement was being analyzed. The officers were asked to recount the events again, from the moment they first noticed the SUV to the collision. They tried to remain calm, describing the night in detail, but it was impossible to ignore the weight of the situation. Every detail seemed to matter more than they had realized. The investigators brought out security footage from nearby buildings and traffic cameras. The officers watched the video carefully. The collision looked worse on screen than it had in real life. The impact, the movement of the vehicles, and the reactions of bystanders were all visible. The officers felt a mixture of shame and anxiety, realizing that the footage would leave little room for excuses. They could see the damage clearly, and it was undeniable. The investigators also asked questions that were harder to answer. Why had they approached the vehicle in the way they did? Why hadn't they called for backup sooner? Were they aware of the potential significance of the SUV? Each question pushed the officers to think critically about their actions. They knew they had acted on instinct, but instinct alone wasn't enough when dealing with high-profile situations. The investigators listened carefully, occasionally taking notes, occasionally exchanging silent glances that made the officers feel even more under pressure. While the investigation continued, the officers noticed the presence of federal agents. These were the same individuals who had arrived the night of the collision. They were calm, professional, and efficient. They asked questions in a measured tone, never raising their voices. But their presence was enough to make the officers feel the seriousness of the situation. The agents were clearly experienced in handling sensitive matters, and the officers realized that this incident was more complex than they had first imagined. The officers were also informed that the SUV had advanced security features. Cameras, sensors, and alarms meant that the vehicle could detect impacts, monitor surroundings, and alert officials instantly. The collision had triggered several of these systems, which is why federal agents had responded so quickly the previous night. Knowing this added to the officers' sense of responsibility. Their actions had caused more than just physical damage. They had triggered security protocols and brought high-level officials into the situation. Throughout the day, the officers were asked to provide statements and clarify details multiple times. Every repetition felt like reliving the accident. They had to describe their thought process, the speed of their response, and the reasons behind their decisions. They were honest, but honesty didn't erase the tension. They understood that their words could influence the outcome of the investigation, and that knowledge made each moment feel heavier. As the investigation progressed, the officers realized how interconnected the situation had become. Local authorities, federal agents, and security officials were all involved. Each step of the process had to be carefully documented, and each interaction required caution. The officers felt like they were navigating a complex web, one misstep away from making the situation worse. It was overwhelming. But it also highlighted the importance of procedure and communication in law enforcement. Meanwhile, the SUV remained in a secured facility. The officers were not allowed near it. They were shown photographs and reports of the damage, which were meticulously detailed. Every scratch, dent, and broken light was documented. The officers could see that the incident was taken very seriously, and they felt the weight of the consequences even more. It wasn't just about the vehicle. It was about accountability and responsibility. By afternoon, the officers were called in for another round of questioning. This time, the questions focused on judgment and decision-making. Investigators wanted to know why the officers had acted quickly without confirming the situation fully. They were asked about alternative approaches, possible risks, and how they could have handled it differently. The officers reflected on their choices and admitted where they could have done better. Their honesty seemed to be appreciated, but it didn't reduce the stress. The officers also realized how much public attention the incident was drawing. Even without direct media involvement, news had started to spread through social circles and local communities. The officers felt the pressure of being watched, judged, and analyzed. It was a reminder that law enforcement work isn't just about rules and procedures. It's also about public perception, trust, responsibility. As the day came to a close, the officers were asked to stay on administrative leave. They were told to prepare for further meetings, potential training, and more detailed investigations. It was clear that the consequences would be long. The officers left the precinct quietly, reflecting on the lessons they had learned. They understood that their actions, though unintentional, had significant implications. That evening, both officers sat quietly, thinking about how quickly things had escalated. A routine patrol had turned into a complex investigation involving multiple agencies. They realized how important it was to remain calm, aware, and thoughtful in every action they took. The incident had exposed weaknesses, highlighted the need for careful judgment, and taught them that even small mistakes could have wide-reaching effects as they prepared for the next day. They both understood that the investigation would continue and that they needed to remain professional and composed. They reflected on the importance of learning from mistakes, cooperating with authorities, and accepting responsibility. The accident was no longer just an unfortunate event. It was a pivotal moment in their careers that would influence how they approached their work in the future. The following days were tense and filled with uncertainty. The officers were still on administrative leave, spending hours thinking about the accident and the growing consequences. Every call, every message, and even every notification on their phones seemed to carry the weight of the situation. They knew that this was no longer a routine mistake. It had turned into a matter that involved serious accountability. The formal notifications arrived from the police department and the federal agency. One officer was informed about a suspension and pending disciplinary review, while the other was told there could be additional administrative actions depending on the final report. The letters outlined expectations, instructions, and consequences. Reading them left the officers with a heavy sense of responsibility and a clear understanding that mistakes could no longer be brushed aside. Repair. Estimates for the SUV were provided. The officers were shown detailed reports about the damage. Every dent, scratch, and broken component was listed, along with the cost to repair. They realized that the vehicle wasn't just expensive, it was specialized and required precise attention to restore. It was more than a financial issue. It was a reminder that their actions had created a ripple effect that involved multiple agencies and high-level officials. The officers attended several meetings with their supervisors and the federal representatives. In these meetings, they were expected to answer questions about judgment, adherence to protocol, and alternatives they could have taken. The discussions were serious but fair. The investigators emphasized learning from the incident, understanding the importance of procedure and maintaining composure under pressure. The officers listened intently, trying to absorb the lessons and accept the consequences with professionalism. Training sessions were scheduled to address the gaps highlighted by the incident. They covered topics such as handling high-profile situations, recognizing potential security risks, and de-escalation techniques. The sessions were intensive and detailed, but the officers appreciated them. They understood that while the events had been stressful, they also offered an opportunity to improve and prevent similar mistakes in the future. Outside the formal procedures, the officers felt the weight of public attention. Even though the story was not widespread in the media, word had spread within the community. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues whispered about the incident. The officers felt the invisible pressure, knowing that their actions were being scrutinized, not only by officials, but also by people who respected and trusted them in their roles. This awareness added to their sense of responsibility. The officers also had conversations with their peers. Some offered support and understanding, while others reminded them of the seriousness of the situation. Each conversation helped them process what had happened and how to move forward. They realized that accepting responsibility, cooperating with investigations, and demonstrating professionalism were key steps in restoring trust and credibility. Meanwhile, the SUV continued to be monitored and repaired under federal supervision. The officers were kept informed about the progress, though they were not involved in the process. Every update was a reminder of the significance of their actions. They reflected on how a momentary decision had escalated into a situation involving multiple layers of accountability and oversight. The officers also began to think about the long-term impact on their careers. They understood that their actions would be reviewed for months and might influence future assignments, promotions, and trust within the department. It was a sobering realization, but it also reinforced the importance of careful judgment, attention to detail, and adherence to procedure. They knew that moving forward, every decision mattered more than ever. Despite the pressure, the officers found small ways to manage stress. They discussed strategies for staying calm during emergencies, the importance of preparation and learning from mistakes without letting them define their careers. They shared experiences from past shifts, trying to balance the serious lessons of this incident with the reality that mistakes, when handled responsibly, could become powerful learning opportunities. As the days passed, the officers began to feel a sense of resolution. The investigations were progressing, and while the consequences were clear, the process was fair. They had cooperated fully, acknowledged their mistakes, and participated in all required training. Slowly, they started to rebuild confidence in their abilities and trust in the system. The incident was still serious. They were learning how to move forward. Reflecting on the experience, both officers recognized how much they had learned. The accident had taught them about accountability, professionalism, and the importance of remaining composed under pressure. It also highlighted the importance of cooperation, communication, and transparency with colleagues and higher authorities. These lessons would guide them in future decisions, ensuring they approached every situation with caution and clarity. By the end of the week, the officers had reached a point where they could focus on learning rather than fear. They knew the consequences would remain. But they also understood that handling the situation with honesty, professionalism, and dedication could help repair their reputation. The experience had been difficult, but it was also transformative, shaping them into more aware and responsible law enforcement officers as they prepared for the next steps in their careers. They realized the true value of reflection and growth. The accident was no longer just a mistake. It was a lesson in responsibility, accountability, and careful judgment. It reminded them that even in the most routine moments, every decision mattered, and that professionalism and integrity were the pillars of their work. They carried these lessons forward, aware that the path ahead would require vigilance, patience, and a commitment to doing better every day. The days following the investigation were quiet but heavy with reflection. The two officers spent a lot of time thinking about what had happened, how it had affected them both personally and professionally. They realized that the accident, though unintentional, had consequences far beyond what they could have imagined. It had touched on responsibility, judgment, and accountability in ways they hadn't faced before. Meetings with supervisors and federal representatives continued, but the tone began to shift slightly. The officers were no longer just being questioned, they were being guided. They were asked about lessons learned and how they could apply these experiences in future situations. The officers shared their thoughts honestly, explaining how the accident had changed their approach to high-pressure situations and how they now understood the importance of pausing, assessing, and verifying information before acting. The SUV had been fully repaired by this point. The officers were shown before and after photographs, which made them reflect on the severity of the damage they had caused. Seeing the vehicle restored to its original state was a small relief, but it also reinforced the lesson that even minor errors could create ripple effects that reached far beyond their immediate view. They understood that every action had a consequence, and careful decision-making was essential in their work. The department formally documented the outcome of the investigation. One officer faced a temporary suspension and required additional training, while the other received a formal reprimand and also attended the training sessions. The official notices were clear, fair, and detailed. While the consequences were serious, they were also measured, reflecting the officers' cooperation and honesty throughout the process. The officers recognized that accountability was not just about punishment, it was about growth, learning, and improvement. During the final meetings, the officers were praised for their transparency and professionalism. The federal representatives acknowledged that mistakes happen, but they emphasized that responsibility and willingness to learn were what distinguished good officers from careless ones. The officers felt a sense of validation. They had been through a difficult experience, but they had done their best to face it with integrity. The experience also strengthened their relationship with their colleagues. Officers who had initially been critical now expressed support, recognizing the pressure and complexity of the situation. The officers received advice on handling similar incidents in the future and on how to communicate clearly during emergencies. This support helped them regain confidence and reminded them that teamwork and trust were essential in law enforcement. As the situation settled, the officers reflected on their personal growth. They realized that the accident had tested their patience, judgment, and emotional control. They had learned the importance of thinking ahead, assessing situations carefully, and considering all possible outcomes before taking action. These lessons were difficult, but invaluable. Shaping the way they approached their daily work and interactions with the public, the officers also took time to think about public perception. Even though the incident involved high-level officials and specialized equipment, it had lessons for everyone in law enforcement. They understood that actions, even unintentional ones, could affect reputation, trust, and credibility. This awareness strengthened their commitment to professionalism and careful judgment in every situation. In quiet moments, the officers reflected on the importance of communication. The accident had shown that clarity in reporting, transparency in actions, and honesty in explanations were crucial. They realized that effective communication could prevent misunderstandings, reduce tension, and ensure that every decision was well documented and understood. They made a mental note to apply this lesson in all future interactions, whether on patrol or during high-pressure incidents. Over time, officers began to feel a sense of closure. The investigations were complete, the SUV was repaired, and the consequences were known and accepted. They understood that, while mistakes could not be erased, how they responded to them defined their careers and character. By facing the situation directly, cooperating fully, and learning from the experience, they had turned a difficult event into an opportunity for growth. The officers returned to full duty with a renewed sense of purpose. They approached every shift with greater awareness, patience, and caution. They shared the lessons they had learned with newer officers, emphasizing the importance of careful judgment, responsibility, and professionalism. The incident, once a source of stress and fear, had become a story of growth, learning, and resilience. In the end, the officers understood that this event would remain a significant memory in their careers, not as a mark of failure, but as a turning point that strengthened their skills, judgment, and understanding of responsibility. They learned that even in the most routine moments, every decision mattered. They carried these lessons forward, aware that integrity, accountability, and careful thinking were essential in every action they took. Looking back, the officers felt a quiet pride in how they had handled the situation. It had been difficult, stressful, and challenging, but they had faced it honestly, professionally, and with a willingness to learn. They knew the experience would guide them for the rest of their careers, shaping the way they approached every decision, every action, and every responsibility. The accident, once a moment of fear and uncertainty, had become a lasting lesson in growth, resilience, and the true meaning of accountability in law enforcement.